When I saw my brother standing in the hallway of that empty hotel, holding the room keys in one hand and a bottle of red wine in the other, my chest tightened, but not from joy. And not from nostalgia either. It was the way he looked at me. As if I had already disappointed him, before I even stepped across the threshold. I tried to smile, to say something light like, "This place hasn't changed a bit," but my voice caught in my throat. He said nothing, just nodded toward the stairs. I followed him up the dusty carpet like a child being led to detention. Each step I took felt like slipping deeper into a memory I never agreed to revisit. The walls were still lined with faded floral wallpaper. The smell was the same, mildew, wood, and something old that refused to die. I was here to relax, to spend a quiet weekend as a family, but something was already off. Especially when I learned we wouldn't be alone. My ex-husband had checked in an hour before me. And my brother? He hadn't mentioned that once. Let me tell you how it all happened. But before I share the secret I tried so hard to keep buried, let me ask you something. Have you ever been manipulated by someone you love, not out of cruelty, but out of obsession, the kind of love that disguises itself as protection? Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And ask yourself this, what if the betrayal wasn't between a wife and her husband, but between a sister and her brother? The first message came on a Tuesday evening. I was sitting by the window with a glass of warm wine, not because I wanted it, but because I didn't want to waste what was left in the bottle. My phone buzzed on the table. Asterisk, come spend the weekend at the old place. Just us. No one else. You need this. Asterisk. It was from my brother. Short, vague, typical of him. But something about it made me hesitate. The "you need this" part. He always thought he knew what was best for me. And sometimes, he did. When our parents died, when my marriage ended, when I cried on his couch for 2 days straight after losing the job I'd hated anyway, he was there. But lately, I'd started to resent how he inserted himself into the quiet corners of my life. Still, I replied. Asterisk, are you sure it's still open? Asterisk. He sent a photo. The outside of the hotel. Boarded windows, but the main entrance looked newly painted. A sign leaning slightly to the side read, Asterisk Meadow Pines, since 1968. Asterisk. I packed that night. The drive took 4 hours. Trees blurred past in streaks of green and gold. I kept the radio low and my thoughts lower. Every 20 minutes or so, I debated turning around. But something pulled me forward, curiosity, guilt, maybe both. Half an hour from the hotel, the sky broke open. Rain hammered the windshield. My wipers screeched in protest. Then, without warning, the car began to shudder. The engine coughed once, twice, and then silence. I pulled to the side, cursed under my breath, and stared at the dashboard like it would offer an answer. It didn't. I tried calling my brother, but the signal was weak. The message didn't send. 20 minutes later, a tow truck appeared, unprompted. A man with a ball cap and a crooked smile waved at me. You must be the lady going to Meadow Pines, he said, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Your guy called ahead. My guy. Of course he did. The hotel was more decrepit than I remembered. We used to come here as kids, before the fights, before the separations, before everything cracked beneath the surface. Now it stood like a monument to something long dead. The lobby was empty. A bell sat on the counter, tarnished and silent. I rang it anyway. A woman appeared, her voice raspy but polite, and handed me a key with a wooden tag, room 9. Your brother said you'd arrive soon, she added. He left this for you. A note, folded once. His handwriting hadn't changed. Asterisk dinner at 7. Make yourself at home. Asterisk. Room 9 smelled like wet fabric and mothballs. The curtains were drawn tight. I opened them and saw nothing but forest. The air inside was heavy, as if it hadn't moved in years. I took a long, hot shower, hoping to scrub off the discomfort that clung to my skin. It didn't work. At 6:55, I made my way downstairs. The dining room was dimly lit, table set for 3. That stopped me. 3. Not 2. Before I could process it, I heard a familiar voice behind me. Softer now, slower. I wasn't sure you'd come. I turned. It was him. My ex-husband stood there, hands in pockets, like we hadn't divorced 5 years ago, like he hadn't moved across the country to start over. He wore the same leather jacket he used to leave on our kitchen chair. His hair was grayer, but his eyes were just as unreadable. I didn't know you'd be here, I managed. I didn't know either, he said. Your brother invited me 2 days ago. Said it might help. My stomach turned. Help what? The 3 of us ate dinner in almost complete silence. My brother dominated the conversation, telling old stories, laughing at memories that didn't feel funny anymore. He poured more wine than we could drink. At one point, he got up to check the generator. He never returned that night. I sat alone with my ex. The clock ticked loud in the background. He glanced at me between sips. You look tired, he said. I am. Still the same. Always carrying too much. I didn't answer. Later, back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, trying to connect the dots. Why were we both here? What did my brother expect to happen? The light flickered once, then again. I didn't sleep well. Not because of the bed. But because something about this place, about this weekend, felt like the beginning of something irreversible. And I had no idea what it would cost. The morning came slowly, dragging light across the wooden floor like it wasn't sure it was welcome here. I woke up feeling disoriented, my body stiff from a night of restless sleep and my mind replaying that dinner over and over. The table set for 3. My brother's sudden disappearance. The presence of my ex-husband, sitting too close, too calm. I lay there for a while, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, and listening. The hotel had a peculiar way of sounding alive, pipes groaning, floorboards creaking, as if it sighed with its own memories. I didn't want to move, but I couldn't stay in bed either. I dressed slowly, choosing comfort over appearance, layering a soft sweater over my thin t-shirt. I tied my hair back, looked at my reflection in the mirror, and barely recognized the woman staring back. Something about the way the light fell on my cheekbones made me look older than I remembered. Tired, yes, but also harder. Sharper. When I came downstairs, the dining room was empty. The plates from last night were gone, the table cleared. A faint smell of coffee floated in from the back kitchen, and I followed it like a lifeline. My ex was already there, pouring a second cup, standing with his back to me. You're up, he said, not turning. I didn't answer right away. I didn't want to fall into easy conversation. I didn't want to pretend this was normal. I didn't sleep much, I finally said. He turned, offered the coffee. I took it, reluctantly, if only because my hands needed something to do. We stood in silence for a while, facing opposite ends of the room, sipping. I don't know what your brother's doing, he said eventually. But I have a feeling we're not here just to catch up. I appreciated the honesty. It made it easier to admit what I already suspected. Did he tell you anything? I asked. He shook his head. Just said I should come. That it might help you. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat. I hated that. That phrasing. Like I was some project to fix. Like grief or loneliness could be solved by throwing me in a room with the man who left me. I don't need help, I said, quieter than I intended. I know, he replied. And for a moment, it felt like he meant it. The rest of the morning passed slowly. I wandered the halls of the hotel, the wooden floors moaning beneath my steps. The wallpaper, once colorful, was faded to a yellowish hue. Every room I peeked into felt like a ghost of its former self. Chairs covered in white sheets, dust forming soft outlines of forgotten things. I tried to call my brother again. No answer. I left a message this time, my tone calm but curt. I didn't ask where he was, I told him to call me. I wanted answers. I wanted control. Later, I found myself in the sunroom on the second floor, one of the only spaces that still let the light in. The glass was old, cloudy, but it warmed the room. I sat there with a book I couldn't focus on, trying to find a rhythm in the silence. Every time I turned a page, I imagined him walking through the door. My brother. Holding more keys. Making more decisions on my behalf. Instead, it was my ex who appeared. Again. Mind if I sit? He asked. I gestured vaguely toward the chair across from me. I feel like we're trapped in a play, I said. Like someone else wrote this script and forgot to tell us. He smiled, but there was sadness behind it. It's familiar, though, isn't it? Us. In a quiet room. Pretending everything's fine. I didn't want to talk about the past. Not yet. Not like this. I came here to get away from things, I said. Not walk into some experiment. He leaned back in the chair, crossing his arms. He always did think he knew best. That was the first time we said it out loud, what we were both thinking. That my brother was orchestrating something. That none of this was coincidence. The day passed with little clarity. I avoided the kitchen, the dining room, any place that felt too intimate. Instead, I stayed near windows, watched the wind rustle the trees, tried to remember who I was before all of this. Before the collapse of our marriage. Before I began defining myself by what others needed. By early evening, I was restless. I walked the perimeter of the hotel, following the dirt path we used to race around as kids. Everything felt smaller now. The trees, once towering, looked tired. I passed the gazebo where I had kissed someone for the first time, someone I didn't even remember the name of. Just the warmth of it, and how alive I had felt. When I returned inside, my ex was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. He looked at me for a long moment, and before I could brace myself, he stepped closer. We kissed. Those two words came without warning. As if they had been hovering between us all day, waiting to fall. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. My heart was pounding, not from excitement, but from the sudden drop in certainty. I stood there, frozen. I didn't push him away. I didn't step forward either. My body betrayed me with stillness. When I finally moved, it was to walk past him. Wordless. My fingers brushed against the wooden banister, and I climbed the stairs like I was climbing out of my own skin. Back in my room, I sat at the edge of the bed again. Just like the night before. Except now, something had shifted. Not because I wanted it to. Because it already had. The next morning, I woke with the distinct feeling that something had changed. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in the subtler, quieter way where nothing looks different, and yet everything feels slightly off-center. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, trying to name what it was. The room was the same, the worn floorboards beneath my feet, the thick curtains that barely let the light through. But my skin felt too tight, like I had outgrown the moment I had just woken into. I couldn't stop replaying yesterday in my head. The kiss had been brief, almost careless in how simply it happened. There had been no build-up, no breathless tension, just the movement, the contact, and then stillness. The weight of it didn't land until hours later. And now, it sat somewhere behind my ribs, dull and unyielding. I didn't want to see him. I didn't want to talk about it. But I also couldn't pretend it didn't happen. I told myself I would go downstairs, make coffee, keep a safe distance. I would act normal until he did something that broke the spell, or confirmed it. As I stepped into the hallway, I noticed something strange. My brother's door, at the far end, across from the stairwell, was open. Not just ajar, but wide open, as if waiting for someone to notice. I paused, then walked slowly toward it. The room inside was clean, but lived in. The bed was made, but the pillow bore the faint indentation of sleep. A coat was hung neatly on the chair. On the small wooden desk, I saw his familiar handwriting on a notepad. At first, I thought it might be a message, something left for me or the hotel staff. But when I looked closer, I realized it wasn't meant to be read by anyone. It was a list. Names. Dates. Some crossed out, others circled. My name appeared twice. It chilled me. Not because of what it said, but because of what it suggested to planning, deliberation. A need for control masked as care. I left the room without touching anything else, feeling like I had just stepped into a thought I wasn't supposed to hear. In the kitchen, the smell of burnt toast greeted me. He was already there, my ex. He didn't look surprised to see me. In fact, he looked like he'd been waiting. "We should talk," he said, his voice soft. I didn't sit down. I didn't want to offer comfort or proximity. "I found your brother's notes," I said. "In his room." That caught him off guard. His eyebrows knit together, and for the first time since we'd arrived, he seemed unsure. "What kind of notes?" I shook my head. "Does it matter?" "The point is, he brought us here for a reason. And I'm starting to think it has nothing to do with healing." He looked away then, toward the window above the sink. Outside, the trees moved with the wind, slow and unbothered by the tension inside the hotel. "He asked me to come," he said after a pause. "Told me you were struggling. That maybe if I showed up, it would help you put things behind you." I laughed, but it was hollow. "Put what behind me?" "The marriage? The years I spent trying to rebuild myself?" He didn't answer, and I didn't expect him to. I left the room, letting my footsteps echo behind me. I needed air. I walked to the back of the hotel, through the overgrown path that led to the greenhouse. It hadn't been used in years. The glass panes were dirty, most of them cracked, and the metal frame was rusted at the base. Still, there was something quiet about it, something comforting. I stood inside it for a while, breathing in the dampness, the rot, the faint scent of forgotten plants. I remembered coming here as a child. My brother used to pick dead leaves off the vines, pretending he was saving them. I never understood why he cared so much about things that were already gone. The thought made my stomach tighten. By noon, I decided I couldn't stay still. I needed to leave the property, even just for a few hours. I went back to my room, grabbed my purse, and headed outside. But the car was gone. It took me a moment to register it. I stared at the space where it should have been, then checked my pockets instinctively for the keys I had locked away in my nightstand. That's when the unease turned into something closer to panic. I ran back inside, up the stairs, into my room. The drawer was open. Empty. I stood frozen for a beat, listening to my heartbeat thudding against my ribs. It didn't feel like a theft. It felt like a boundary being drawn. Someone wanted me here. Someone wanted me to stay. The rest of the afternoon passed in slow motion. I didn't tell anyone about the car. I didn't accuse. I simply waited for my brother to return, for an explanation, for anything that would make this feel less like a trap. He didn't show up. Not a call, not a text. My ex hovered in the common spaces but didn't speak to me. There was a strange courtesy between us now, like two guests in a museum, tiptoeing around exhibits they didn't want to acknowledge. As the sun dipped low, I found myself back in the dining room, sitting in the same seat I had the first night. The table was bare this time, no plates, no glasses. Just silence. I let my hands rest in my lap, palms down, grounding myself. I wasn't afraid. Not exactly. But I was wary in a way that felt primal. Like I had just started to notice the edges of something I wasn't supposed to see. Later that evening, as I passed the hallway again, I glanced at my brother's door. Now it was shut. No sound came from inside. No light. But I knew, without question, that he had returned. And for some reason, he didn't want me to know. I stood there a long time, unsure whether to knock. In the end, I didn't. The following morning, the sunlight was thin and colorless, diffused through a gray veil of clouds. The forest surrounding the hotel stood still, unnaturally so, like it was listening. I sat on the windowsill of my room for what felt like hours, watching the trees barely sway in the breeze. The longer I sat there, the more I realized how exhausted I was, not from a lack of sleep, but from the undercurrent of confusion and restraint that had followed me since the moment I arrived. Something was building, silently, and I didn't know where the pressure would break first, outside of me, or inside. I didn't feel like pretending that morning. I skipped the kitchen. I skipped coffee. I left my room without brushing my hair and wrapped my cardigan tightly around me like armor. When I passed my brother's door, it was slightly ajar again. The angle was intentional, inviting, but cautious. I didn't slow my steps. I didn't look inside. I went straight to the carport, hoping that maybe, against reason, my car had returned. It hadn't. The empty space remained, along with my growing suspicion that everything happening here was choreographed. The question wasn't whether I was part of a plan. The question was how long ago it had begun. When I returned to the lobby, my ex was there, sitting in the old armchair with a half-finished crossword in his lap. He looked up, eyes narrowing slightly when he saw me. "You're up early," he said. I needed air. He didn't ask any questions. And that, more than anything, told me he was finally starting to feel it too, the weight, the surveillance, the edge of something unspoken pressing in on both of us. I didn't sit down. I walked to the reception desk, where the guest book still sat open. The last name written was his. His neat cursive, a name I used to sign next to without thinking. There were no other names after that. None from my brother. None from me. I flipped back several pages. The book was empty. We weren't registered. It felt like a whisper of a fact, but it rang too loudly in my mind to ignore. I closed the book slowly and turned to face the hallway again, as if it might explain something. By early afternoon, my nerves had turned to action. I told myself I needed to leave the hotel, even for an hour. Even on foot. There was a town a few miles away. I didn't care about the weather or the roads or whether my absence would be noticed. I needed the distance. I grabbed a bag, packed it with what little I'd brought that still felt mine, my wallet, a scarf, a pen, a small notebook I always kept for sketching but rarely used. I didn't leave a note. I walked straight out through the side entrance and down the winding trail that led through the backwoods toward the main road. The walk was slow, the dirt path soaked from earlier rain. My shoes were muddy within minutes, but I didn't stop. Every step felt like claiming something back. It took almost half an hour to reach the road. I stood at the edge of the asphalt, unsure which direction to turn. There was no traffic, just the distant hum of wind through branches. I chose left. It didn't take long before I heard the sound of tires behind me. I turned. A silver sedan approached, old, unfamiliar. I moved off the shoulder, preparing to wave it down if it slowed. It didn't. It passed with a blur, and I caught only a glimpse of the driver, a man, wearing sunglasses. He didn't glance in my direction. There was no license plate. I stood there, rooted to the spot, long after the car disappeared. The road was empty again. After another hour of walking, I reached the edge of the nearby town. It wasn't much, just a few buildings, a gas station, a diner with a flickering neon sign. I stepped inside the diner, grateful for the change in air, the warmth of something real. I sat at the counter, ordered black coffee, and sipped it slowly, hoping the bitterness would anchor me. I asked the waitress if I could use the phone. She pointed to a payphone near the restrooms. It didn't work. I returned to my seat. She placed a plate of toast in front of me without asking. I nodded my thanks. She smiled in that distant, practiced way that told me she didn't care why I was here. I stared out the window as I ate, my reflection faint in the glass, layered over the view of a quiet street and shuttered stores. For the first time since arriving at the hotel, I thought about home. My actual home. My neighborhood, my bed, the plants I always forgot to water. Everything I had left in pause. I had thought this trip would clear my head. Instead, it made everything louder. Around late afternoon, I started walking back. Not because I wanted to return, but because I didn't want to sleep in that town, surrounded by strangers, with nothing but questions. I needed answers. And I wouldn't find them in a diner. The road back felt longer. My legs ached. The forest looked darker now, the sky beginning to tint with the slow slide of evening. When I finally reached the hotel again, the first thing I noticed was the light in my room. It was on. I hadn't left it that way. I climbed the stairs carefully, my hand gripping the rail harder than necessary. At the door, I paused, listening. Nothing. Inside, everything looked exactly as I left it. Almost. The bed was made. Perfectly. The drawer I had found empty, the one where my car keys had been, was now closed, but when I opened it, the keys were inside. Placed neatly. Centered. Someone had been in here. I backed away slowly, shutting the drawer. My hands trembled as I sat down on the edge of the bed. I stared at the door, then at the window. My brother was somewhere in this building. He had come back. And he had been in my space. Not to hurt me. Not to scare me. To remind me, he was in control. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't turn the light off. I lay under the covers, fully dressed, listening to every sound the old hotel made. Every creak. Every sigh. By morning, the light outside had shifted from gray to pale gold, but I felt no warmth in it. I sat in the same spot I'd been most of the night, propped up against the headboard, legs tucked under me, still fully dressed. The lamp beside the bed had stayed on, casting long shadows across the far wall. I hadn't dared turn it off. The silence in the hotel was too sharp, too deliberate, as if every creak and hush had meaning now. I didn't know what time my brother had returned. I didn't know when he'd entered my room, placed the keys where I would find them, or made the bed with meticulous precision. But I knew it had been him. No one else would have done it with such quiet calculation. When I finally stood and stretched my aching limbs, I felt heavier than the day before. Not tired in a physical sense, but worn down by the slow erosion of certainty. Every detail that once felt benign, our shared past, this place, even the silence between us, now felt charged. I showered quickly, avoiding the mirror. I wasn't ready to look myself in the eye. Downstairs, the hotel seemed more alive than it had in days. My brother was in the kitchen, the faint clatter of dishes echoing through the walls. The sound was ordinary, almost domestic, but it filled me with unease. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him move. He hadn't changed much. Same careful posture, same unhurried movements. He always looked like he was arranging something invisible. I used to find comfort in that. Now I saw it for what it was, control masked as care. He looked up when he noticed me. "You're up early," he said, voice casual, like we were just siblings on a weekend retreat. I nodded but said nothing. He gestured toward the counter. "I made tea. Figured you'd want something warm." I poured myself a cup. My hands weren't steady, but I kept them close to the mug, hoping the heat would ground me. He leaned against the sink, watching me too closely. "I saw your car outside. I'm glad you found your keys." I met his eyes then. Calm. Too calm. "You were in my room," I said. He tilted his head slightly, pretending to think. "I wanted to make sure you were okay. You could have knocked. I didn't want to wake you." I said nothing. I wasn't going to argue over a lie we both recognized. He went on. "You used to leave your door open, remember? When we were kids. You hated closed doors. That was a long time ago." He didn't respond to that. He turned and started rinsing a glass that didn't need rinsing, his back to me, but his shoulders were too still. I left the kitchen without finishing my tea. As I walked down the hallway toward the dining room, I saw my ex-husband sitting alone at the table, flipping through an old photo album I didn't remember bringing. It must have been one of my brother's. I approached slowly, unsure what I'd find on those pages. He looked up. "These are from that summer in Maine," he said quietly, tapping a photo. "You're wearing that striped dress you loved." I looked over his shoulder. There I was, squinting at the sun, barefoot in the sand. My brother had taken the photo. He took most of them. I'd forgotten how many weekends the three of us used to share. At the time, it had felt like family. I reached for the album and closed it gently. "This isn't a trip down memory lane," I said. "It's something else." He's trying to make a point, but I don't know what it is. My ex looked at me like he wanted to say something, but didn't. Instead, he stood and walked away, leaving me alone with the book. Later that day, I walked the perimeter of the property again. The wind was colder than before, the sky overcast. I followed the same worn path I'd taken the first day, letting the motion settle the restless thoughts inside me. I ended up behind the greenhouse, where the wooden fence was broken. Beyond it, the old tool shed leaned precariously to one side, half swallowed by vines. I'd forgotten it even existed. Curiosity, or instinct, led me closer. Inside, it was musty and cramped. Dust coated every surface, and the light filtering through the cracks in the boards made long slashes across the floor. There were gardening tools, old crates, and a stack of yellowed newspapers bound with twine. But it was the bench against the back wall that caught my attention. On it sat another notepad, just like the one I'd seen in his room. This one was open. Notes again. Phrases. Names. And drawings. Crude sketches of the hotel layout. Arrows pointing to rooms. A timeline. My name appeared over and over. I closed the pad, my heart pounding. There was no doubt now, he had planned every moment. Our arrival. Our placement. Our encounters. This wasn't about healing. It was about observation, manipulation, control. As I stepped back from the bench, I nearly tripped over a crate and caught myself on the edge of the shelf. A dusty photo frame fell and landed face up on the floor. I picked it up, brushing away the grime. It was a picture of the three of us, me, my brother, and my ex. It looked recent. Too recent. I didn't remember this photo being taken. Which meant I hadn't known it was taken. I left the shed quickly, shoving the photo into my coat pocket without thinking. My legs carried me back to the hotel, but my mind was racing. Back inside, I passed the kitchen without stopping. I didn't want tea. I didn't want explanations. I wanted clarity. I wanted to understand what he thought he was doing. In my room, I pulled out the photo and placed it on the nightstand. I stared at it for a long time. We looked peaceful. Comfortable. But the composition was too deliberate. Like a memory curated, not lived. That evening, I didn't speak to either of them. Dinner came and went without ceremony. The three of us sat in silence, eating in the dim light, each trapped in our own separate thoughts. Afterward, I went to the common room and sat in the far corner, watching the fire flicker in the hearth. My brother sat across the room, reading a book. My ex sat near the window, sipping whiskey. We were all present. But nothing felt real. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something irreversible was about to happen. The following morning arrived with an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on the entire hotel. The usual creaks and sighs of the old building were muted, as if even the walls were holding their breath. I woke slowly, each movement feeling heavier than the last, weighed down by the growing tension that wrapped itself around me like a thick fog. I dressed quietly, avoiding the mirror again. The reflection I saw the day before still unsettled me, so I focused instead on the faint sound of birds outside, their chirping a fragile contrast to the stillness inside. I opened the window just a crack, letting a thread of cold air sneak in, reminding me that the world outside hadn't stopped turning, even if mine felt paused. Downstairs, the kitchen was empty. The faint scent of brewed coffee lingered in the air, but no one was around to drink it. I poured myself a cup and sat at the worn wooden table near the window. The view was nothing more than a blur of gray and green, the forest stretching endlessly with no promise of escape. I thought about leaving. About walking out that door and never coming back. But something rooted me in place, a stubborn need to understand, to confront whatever it was that my brother had orchestrated. My thoughts were interrupted by the soft footsteps of my brother approaching. He didn't say anything as he took a seat opposite me, his hands folded neatly on the table. His eyes were steady, unblinking. "You're quiet this morning," he said, breaking the silence. I looked away, tracing the worn grain of the table. Trying to make sense of all this. He nodded slowly. "It's a lot. More than just a weekend at an old hotel." I took a sip of coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. "Why did you bring us here? Why now?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. "Because some things need to be faced. Because sometimes, the past doesn't stay buried just because we want it to." His words were vague, but I sensed they carried more weight than he let on. I pressed on. "And the planning? The notes? The setup?" He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I wanted to see if you could remember who you really are. Not the woman caught between two failed relationships. Not the woman who's lost herself." I stared at him, anger flickering beneath the surface. "You think this was about me? About helping me?" His eyes softened. "I think it was about us. About what we lost." The tension between us thickened. I wanted to believe him. To believe there was some genuine care beneath the manipulation. But years of being second-guessed and controlled made it hard. Later, I found myself wandering the halls aimlessly. Each step echoed like a question unanswered. The walls seemed to lean in closer, whispering memories I tried to ignore. I paused outside the door to my brother's room, now firmly closed, the silence behind it deafening. In the lounge, my ex-husband was seated by the fireplace, his posture relaxed yet guarded. He glanced up as I entered, offering a small, knowing smile. We didn't speak much, but the space between us was charged with unsaid words. As evening approached, the hotel grew colder. The sun dipped behind thick clouds, casting long shadows that stretched and twisted across the floor. I wrapped myself in a shawl and sat near the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance. The weight of the weekend pressed down harder. I realized that whatever answers I sought, they wouldn't come easily. And that some truths might change everything. The storm began without warning as twilight settled over the horizon. Thick clouds gathered rapidly, swallowing the fading light and turning the sky an ominous shade of steel. Inside the hotel, the fragile calm shattered with the sudden roar of thunder. Windows rattled, and the wooden beams groaned under the weight of the gathering tempest. I stood near the window of my room, watching the first streaks of lightning crack across the sky. The air grew heavy, charged, as if the storm was more than weather, it was a reckoning. The hotel felt smaller, enclosed, as the wind howled through the trees and rain battered the roof. The power flickered and then went out completely, plunging the building into darkness. For a moment, I was overwhelmed by the silence that followed. The absence of the hum of electricity made every breath seem louder, every heartbeat more urgent. I reached for the candle on the nightstand, striking a match and lighting it carefully. The soft glow painted the room with trembling shadows, and I felt both comforted and exposed. In the dimness, the familiar became strange, and the past seeped through the cracks. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and made my way down to the common room, where the fire in the hearth still burned, its flames flickering wildly. My brother was there, already seated, a calm presence amid the chaos outside. He motioned for me to sit beside him. Without words, he draped a thick woolen blanket over my lap, the fabric heavy and warm. The storm outside raged on, and we sat together, the only sounds the crackling fire and the occasional roll of thunder. The room, lit only by firelight and candle flickers, felt timeless, suspended between now and then. For hours, we remained silent, letting the weight of the storm settle over us. The tension that had defined the days here softened, replaced by a fragile truce born of shared history and unspoken understanding. Eventually, he spoke quietly, his voice low and steady. "I've always felt we carried too much," he said. "Too much loss, too much silence." I nodded, feeling the truth in his words resonate inside me. He continued, "I wanted this weekend to remind you, that you're more than what's been taken away." His eyes met mine, steady and searching. "I didn't plan everything to trap you," he said. "I planned it to give us a chance to remember." I looked away, the firelight catching the moisture in my eyes. The mix of anger, relief, and confusion churned inside me. We talked then, softly, cautiously, about things we had buried for too long. About childhood dreams, fractured families, and the ache of loneliness that follows when connections break. The hours passed unnoticed. The storm outside softened to a gentle rain. And in the quiet, a fragile hope began to take root, a possibility that healing might start here, in the unlikeliest of places. As the night deepened, exhaustion pulled at me. I rose, feeling the weight of the day settle fully on my shoulders. He offered a small smile, the first genuine one I'd seen from him in days. I nodded in thanks, retreating to my room with the warmth of the fire lingering in my skin. That night, I slept differently, less restless, less haunted. The storm had passed, but its echo remained, a reminder that sometimes, destruction is the first step toward renewal. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting long, pale shadows across the worn floorboards of the hotel room. I woke slowly, the quiet hum of the world outside a stark contrast to the turmoil inside me. For the first time in days, I felt the weight inside begin to shift, not vanish, but loosen just enough to breathe a little easier. I moved carefully, aware of the delicate balance I had found after the storm. Dressing without haste, I left the door slightly open as I stepped out into the hallway. The silence was thick, almost tangible, filled with the echoes of the past few days, the whispered conversations, the stolen glances, the unspoken words hanging between us like fragile glass. Downstairs, the hotel seemed to hold its breath, the light from the large windows casting soft pools of glow across the dusty surfaces. My brother was seated in the lounge, his expression unreadable as he read from a dog-eared book. My ex-husband was nowhere in sight. I took a seat nearby, careful not to disturb the quiet. The warmth from the fire flickered across the walls, dancing shadows that seemed to reach for something just out of grasp. We sat together in companionable silence, two strangers tethered by a shared history, both caught in the delicate web of memory and regret. Later, I found myself wandering the halls again, drawn to the small details that had once felt insignificant, the cracked paint on the banister, the faded photographs lining the stairwell, the scent of old paper and wood mingling with the faintest trace of lavender. I paused outside the room that had become my brother's sanctuary during this weekend, a place I still hadn't entered. The door was closed, but I could hear faint sounds, soft murmurs, the shuffle of papers. Curiosity gnawed at me, but I resisted the urge to knock. Some things, I realized, were better left undisturbed until the right moment. That afternoon, the rain returned, gentle and persistent, tapping a steady rhythm against the windows. I sat by the fireplace once more, letting the warmth seep into my bones as I traced the lines of the photo still resting on my nightstand. The image showed us, the three of us, was frozen in a moment that seemed both distant and achingly close. Our smiles were real, but the framing felt calculated, a memory curated rather than lived. As the day wore on, I sensed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. My brother's presence grew quieter, less imposing, as if he too was yielding to the fragile peace settling over the hotel. My ex returned later that evening, his steps lighter, his demeanor softened. He didn't speak of plans or past mistakes, only offered a quiet understanding that filled the spaces between us with something new, acceptance. As night fell, the hotel seemed to breathe with us, the tension ebbing away like a receding tide. I lay in bed that night with a tentative calm, the weight inside me less oppressive, the future uncertain but no longer overwhelming. I knew the weekend wasn't over, that the journey ahead would demand more courage than I had yet summoned. But in that moment, surrounded by shadows and flickering light, I allowed myself to hope. The morning air was crisp and sharp, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and fading rain. Outside the hotel, the forest stretched endlessly, a dense wall of green that both protected and isolated the place from the world beyond. I stepped out onto the creaking porch, feeling the chill settle deep into my bones, and watched as the mist wove between the trees like a restless ghost. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted once more. The fragile peace of the previous day gave way to a quiet tension that seemed to simmer beneath every glance, every movement. My brother's presence was no longer just a shadow in the background, it had become a force, subtle but insistent, shaping the rhythm of the day. I moved through the rooms with a cautious deliberation, as if each step might uncover something hidden or break a delicate balance. The hotel, with its faded grandeur and peeling wallpaper, felt like a living memory, beautiful and fragile, but vulnerable to collapse. At the breakfast table, the three of us sat with cups of coffee steaming before us, the silence stretching between words unspoken. My ex-husband broke it, his voice low and steady, speaking of mundane things, a news story, the weather, a book he had been reading. His words were a balm, a temporary distraction from the undercurrents swirling just beneath the surface. My brother watched us both, his eyes sharp and unreadable. There was a tension in the air, a weight that neither acknowledged but both felt keenly. Later, I found myself drawn once again to the old photo album. Its pages held images of a past that felt both distant and immediate, the smiles, the shared moments, the fractures concealed beneath the surface. I traced the lines of a photograph of the three of us standing by a lake, sunlight filtering through the trees, laughter frozen in time. The memory was bittersweet. It reminded me of what we had lost and what we were still trying to find. In the afternoon, I took a solitary walk through the surrounding woods. The trail was familiar, worn by years of footsteps, but the forest had reclaimed much of its wildness. Leaves crunched beneath my boots, and the scent of pine filled the air. I thought about the weekend so far, the orchestrated encounters, the silences, the moments of unexpected vulnerability. I thought about my brother's motives, about the lines between care and control, about the fragile thread that connected us all. When I returned to the hotel, the light was fading, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the floor. Inside, the warmth of the fire beckoned, and I settled into the familiar glow. My brother approached quietly, carrying a bottle of wine and 3 glasses. Without words, he poured and handed me one, then took a seat beside me. The 3 of us gathered near the fire, the flames flickering and casting dancing shadows on our faces. For a moment, the past and present seemed to blur, and the distance between us lessened. We spoke softly then, sharing memories, regrets, and hopes. The conversation was tentative, filled with pauses and glances, but it was real. As the night deepened, I felt a sense of release, a shedding of burdens carried too long. Though the road ahead remained uncertain, in that moment, surrounded by the flickering light and the presence of those I had once loved, I allowed myself to believe that healing was possible. And with that belief, the walls that had confined me began to crack, letting in the light of something new. The dawn broke quietly over the horizon, casting a pale light that filtered through the curtains of my room. The hotel was still, save for the faint rustling of leaves outside and the distant call of birds waking to the new day. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything that had unfolded during the weekend pressing against my chest. The nights had been restless, filled with memories and unspoken tensions, but this morning carried a different heaviness, the finality of a chapter closing, the inevitable decision to be made. The air was thick with the knowledge that nothing would be the same after today. I dressed slowly, each movement deliberate, as if by controlling the outside I could steady the storm within. The photograph from the toolshed lay on my nightstand, a silent witness to the past and the tangled web of relationships that had drawn me here. Downstairs, the hotel was hushed. My brother was already awake, sitting near the window, lost in thought. His posture was relaxed but distant, a man carrying burdens I could no longer decipher. My ex-husband was preparing to leave, gathering his things with quiet efficiency. He offered me a brief nod but no words. We both knew this weekend had changed things in ways neither of us fully understood. I approached my brother, my steps steady despite the turmoil inside. He looked up, meeting my gaze with an intensity that belied the calm exterior. There was no need for grand declarations or apologies. In that moment, everything was understood, the regrets, the hopes, the fractures that time had deepened but not broken. I felt a release, a shedding of the roles and expectations that had bound me for so long. As I stepped outside into the morning light, the forest stretched before me, vast and alive. The road back to my life was uncertain, but it was mine to choose. With each step away from the hotel, I carried with me the lessons of the weekend, the pain, the love, the complexities that make us who we are. And for the first time in a long while, I felt the quiet strength of moving forward. All 10 parts of the story are now complete.